observation, maps, and the invisible. Observation, maps, and the invisible eyes of the First World War. War is often remembered through trenches, artillery, and infantry charges, yet beneath every movement and decision lay another quiet, relentless effort, the labor of watching, measuring, recording, and interpreting the world. The First World War depended not only on those who fired weapons, but on those who observed the battlefield, surveyed terrain, charted skies, traced rail lines, mapped artillery ranges, and transformed space into knowledge. This was the war of observation and mapping, a conflict fought through binocular lenses, compasses, notebooks, telegraph wires, aerial photographs, and the disciplined patience of men and women trained to look more carefully than anyone had looked before. The Great War became the first conflict in which seeing was as important as shooting, and where the ability to understand land from above, below, and across great distances shaped the survival of millions. It was a war where horizons mattered, where lines on paper carried the same weight as lines of trenches, and where silence lived beside vigilance. This is the story of the Watchers, the ones who did not merely fight on the battlefield, but studied it. The birth of a new kind of vision. Before 1914, armies still imagined war in terms of movement across open ground, maneuvering formations, and direct observation by officers on horseback or hilltops. Maps were often outdated or generalized, created for peacetime administration rather than combat precision. Landscapes were recorded for roads, farms, and rivers, not artillery trajectories, trench networks, or machine gun arcs. The early months of the war exposed the failure of this old perspective. Once movement halted and trenches spread across miles of countryside, commanders discovered that knowing the exact shape of land, every ridge, ditch, railway, canal, and forest edge mattered more than ever before. A gun placed a few meters too high or too low could miss its target entirely. A misunderstanding of slope or drainage could doom an assault before it began. The war demanded a new way of seeing, analytical, layered, technical, and relentless. Observation shifted from instinct to science. The observers at the front, along trench lines, observation posts became lifelines of information. Built discreetly into shattered buildings, disguised behind ruined walls, or dug into raised ground, they gave narrow, carefully controlled angles of view toward enemy lines. Observers learned to sit motionless for hours, scanning horizons through slits, binocular lenses, or periscopes held just high enough to avoid being seen. Their task was not dramatic, but it carried immense weight. They noted changes in the enemy's landscape. Movement of supply carts, new trenches carved overnight, shifts in barbed wire, fresh mounds of earth indicating dugouts, or tunnels, patterns of smoke revealing artillery positions. Observation sharpened perception until the smallest alteration meant warning. A missing patch of grass, a difference in soil color, or a faint line where none existed before could signal danger. Watching became a form of endurance. The language of maps. Information flowed from observers to cartographers, who transformed raw perception into structured meaning. Map makers lived in rooms filled with paper, drafting tables, rulers, compasses, and ink that stained fingertips and sleeves. Their work required precision and patience, and yet unfolded under pressure, measured not in deadlines, but in lives. They synthesized field sketches, survey data, aerial photographs, reports from patrols, artillery measurements, railway timetables, engineers' notes. Lines were not simply symbols, they were predictions of where soldiers would walk, where shells would fall, where danger concentrated. Every contour line represented elevation, and therefore possibility. Every shaded area suggested concealment or exposure. Maps multiplied in detail. A single battlefield could generate dozens of versions: day maps, night maps, trench maps, communication trench maps, artillery range maps, topographic overlays. War transformed geography into a living science. Aerial eyes above the earth. Perhaps the greatest transformation in observation came from the sky. Aircraft, fragile and skeletal in their beginnings, evolved into platforms for reconnaissance. Cameras were mounted beneath wings or on the fuselage, designed to capture strips of land from above. Pilots and observers flew low enough to see trenches and high enough to avoid direct fire, banking their machines so lenses could face the Earth at precise angles. Glass plates were exposed one by one, each frame a fragment of a larger puzzle. Back on the ground, technicians developed photographs in dark rooms near airfields, working under red light, surrounded by the chemical smell of fixer and developer. Photographs were arranged side by side to form mosaics, vast panoramas of battlefields stitched together from dozens, sometimes hundreds, of images. Cartographers compared old and new photographs to detect even the most subtle changes. Aerial observation changed perspective forever. The war could now be seen as a whole, not only from within, but from above. The landscape transformed into pattern, trenches resembling scars, shell craters like constellations, roads and railways weaving like arteries through ruined plains. War gained a second horizon, the vertical one. Balloons and the stillness of height. Long before aircraft reached their full potential, tethered observation balloons rose into the sky like silent sentinels. Anchored by cables and stabilized by wind, they served as platforms for artillery spotting and battlefield observation. Observers inside wicker or metal baskets watched through telescopes, communicating to the ground by telephone lines that ran along the cables. From these heights, the front appeared as a ribbon stretching into distance, broken and scarred, yet comprehensible. But balloons were vulnerable. Their stillness made them targets. When danger approached, observers leapt from baskets with parachutes, among the earliest regular military uses of them, drifting downward even as flames sometimes consumed the envelope above. Their work demanded calm in the face of exposure. The sky became not only a place of vision, but of risk. Sound, range, and the mathematics of fire. Observation was not limited to sight. Artillery warfare depended on sound ranging and flash spotting, scientific methods that turned physics into military intelligence. Teams positioned microphones across measured distances to record the time differences of gunfire echoes. By calculating those differences, they determined the precise location of enemy artillery. Flash spotting crews did similar work by identifying the brief light bursts of firing guns at night and marking their angles against calibrated grids. This fusion of observation and mathematics reduced uncertainty. Guns could now be targeted without direct sight, guided instead by geometry and careful listening. The battlefield became an equation superimposed on landscape, the human strain of knowing. For all its technical discipline, Observation carried heavy psychological weight. Observers witnessed patterns of destruction unfolding slowly over time. Landscapes changing day after day, trenches deepening, craters multiplying, forests vanishing. They saw preparations for attacks long before soldiers on the ground understood what was coming. They experienced the burden of knowledge. A mapmaker might trace the path where men would soon advance, aware of the risk that awaited them. An observer might note enemy artillery gathering and know that a bombardment would follow. Aerial photographers returned from flights with images that revealed the next stage of suffering. Their role existed between action and helplessness. They could see, but they could not intervene. Codes, signals, and the movement of information. Observation meant little without communication. Information traveled through message runners, telegraph wires, radio transmitters, and coded reports. Signals officers became interpreters of movement, ensuring that observations did not vanish into silence. Wires stretched along trenches and across fields, buried underground or draped along posts, fragile lifelines frequently cut by shell fire and repaired under fire. Rooms filled with clerks copying coordinates, typing reports, filing sketches, storing maps that multiplied faster than they could be used. The war created a world where information itself became terrain. Beyond the front, civilian and global eyes. Observation extended far beyond trenches. Rail networks were monitored for troop movements. Ports and docks were charted and recorded. Neutral nations tracked shipments, weather patterns, and economic indicators. Intelligence communities studied newspapers, coded telegrams, shipping manifests, and financial flows. Maps were drawn not only for battlefields, but for supply routes, colonial territories, industrial centers, and sea lanes. The war's geography became global, and so did its observation. The end of war and the maps that remained. When the armistice came, the watchers did not simply fold their maps and walk away. Their work transitioned into new purposes: border negotiations, reconstruction, land surveys, memorial planning, and post-war administration. The world that emerged from the war was shaped by maps created during it: new national boundaries, transport networks, economic zones, treaty lines. Observation had not only described reality, it had helped create the one that followed. The watchers stepped into peacetime, carrying a different way of seeing space: analytical, precise, layered. The world had become measurable in ways it had never been measured before. And once the world had been seen from above, it could never be unseen. Legacy of the War of Sight. The First World War transformed perception. It accelerated aerial photography, advanced cartography, formalized reconnaissance, and reshaped how militaries, governments, and societies understood space. It turned observation into strategy and maps into instruments of power. Yet behind every innovation stood individuals who sat in silence with binoculars, traced careful lines on paper, listened for distant echoes, or circled high above the earth in fragile machines. They did not conquer land, they interpreted it. Their work rarely appears in monuments, yet it structured the war as surely as any weapon. The Great War was fought on the ground, but it was understood through the eyes that watched it.